All right, so now we're going to talk about the war itself. And if you're excited about battle stories, don't be. Um, if you want good battle stories, sign up for Mr. Malega's class senior year. For those of you that are juniors, for the one of you that's a sophomore, you know who you are. You can sign up for it your junior year. Okay, so if you want stories about the war, stories about the battles, I would recommend taking Mr. Malega's Great American Conflicts class next year, your senior year, where he spends like a whole semester on this type of stuff. And it's a very interesting class and whatnot. But if you're not into battles and stuff, then I probably would not take that class. But I'm just going to hit the basics of the war. Because ultimately, you don't need to know a lot about the war for the AP exam, just a couple key turning points. And so we'll start with the war in Europe, which is the war that the United States prioritized. And we prioritize it because we believe that the Germans were the bigger threat than the Japanese, which that is a point that is easily debated, but for now it just is what it is, and so we will go ahead and proceed. And so there's a map of what's going on in Europe during the war, and we start in 1941. In 1941, what ends up happening is the Germans have taken over much of Europe. Where what you had them take over France in 1940, Norway in 1940, Denmark in 1940. They attempted to attack Britain. You follow the cursor on the map in 1941 and 42. But then they gave up on that, so they took over the rest of Eastern Europe in 1941, all these kind of purplish areas I'm showing. And then in Operation Barbarossa, which you can see listed there, these arrows are going to move into the Soviet Union, where they're going to attack up here at Leningrad. They're going to attack out here through all the way to Moscow, and they're going to attack out to Kiev and the Ukraine over here. And they're going to proceed, where they end up taking over about this much of the rest of the continent of Europe. So obviously, the Germans had pretty much taken over all of Europe, except for England and Spain, which was remaining neutral. Okay, and then Sweden was also a neutral country in this war. All right, 1942, the Germans are going to expand their offensive. They're going to go, whoops, sorry. Let's go back on that. They're going to go, stop. All right, I'm having trouble with the cursor. So what ends up happening is they're going to expand out here. There we go. Okay, they're going to expand out here to Stalingrad, which is where the cursor is right now. Okay, where not only did they go into North Africa and take over some of that, but they're going to go further into Russia and attack Stalingrad. That's going to become a big turning point because from Stalingrad onwards, where the Germans lose over about a third of their army, they're going to start to get pushed back, and the Russians are going to start to make headways. And if you skip ahead about 2 years, the Russians just keep pushing them back, pushing them back, pushing them back. So Stalingrad becomes this big turning point in the war in the East. We, on the other end, start to get involved in the war in Europe with Operation Torch. Now, Operation Torch is going to happen down in North Africa. If you see this green arrow that, turn on cursor, okay. If you see this green arrow down here, this is where the U.S. are going to invade up in Morocco and then work their way across North Africa to Tunisia, and they're going to start to push the Germans and the Italians out of there. Okay, and then from there, they're going to go into Italy. They're going to go into Sicily and then up the Italian peninsula. And this is going to take about 2 years. This is what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. And so this is where they thought they could win the war from and still maintain a lot of influence in the Mediterranean. It's not going to work that way. They're going to bog down in Italy for about 2 years, and they're going to have to turn to a second front elsewhere. And the second front is going to end up being up here in northern France. All right, so the attack on northern France is going to be called Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day sometimes, just for the name of the beginning of the operation, June 6, 1944, where an American and British and Canadian and Polish armies going to attack down here. I think there were a few Australian troops there as well, and begin to retake the continent, at least the western part of the continent, from the Germans. And so they're going to attack here. It's going to take a couple weeks to get a beach hold, and then after a couple months, they're going to start pushing east into Germany. And in the midst of this, where it looks like the war is starting to win, we have the election of 1944. And in the election of 44, FDR is running for a fourth term. And like I said before, he had Henry Wallace, the socialist, as his vice president, So he's going to have to come up with somebody more moderate as FDR is starting to get older. People know he might not survive this next term. As he's going to pick the more moderate candidate, Harry Truman, a senator from Missouri who was very aggressive against Stalin and Hitler, wanted to win the war, but he was also more moderate than Henry Wallace, who was a socialist, as I mentioned. And so he's going to be the running mate, and he's going to run against a Republican named Thomas Dewey. And Thomas Dewey, Republicans thought had a really good chance at beating FDR, but to make a long story short, FDR wins pretty easily. And with FDR winning, that means he's going to finish the war, or at least try to, but he's going to end up dying before that. Okay, so the Battle of the Bulge is going to be the last it's going to be the biggest battle the U.S. was involved in. It's the last big German push. The Germans send a huge army this way, where the cursor is, to try and push the U.S. and the British back into the ocean. It doesn't work. It leads to a lot of casualties. Thousands and thousands of soldiers are going to be killed. And it's the last German attempt to stop this defeat. Obviously, it fails. And so with that, the U.S. is going to keep pushing in from the west. The Russians are going to keep pushing in from the east, and Germany is about to collapse. And in the midst of this, we have a very important conference in Yalta. Okay, the Yalta Conference, February 1945, is going to be, as you can see in this picture, between Joseph Stalin on the right, FDR in the middle, and Winston Churchill on the left, the leader of Britain, Stalin the leader of the Soviets, and FDR our leader. Where basically they're going to be discussing how do we end World War II, and then what do we do in the post-war period. Because by February, the war was not over, but it looked like it was going to end soon, at least in Europe. And so they wanted to know what to do. And in the midst of this meeting, the major thing that comes out of this historically is where FDR wants the Russians to help with Japan. So they basically tell the Soviets, hey, we would like you to invade Japan as soon as the war in Europe is over. But Joseph Stalin says, I will only do that if you make a promise to me. And the promise is he wanted Eastern Europe. So he wanted all these countries over here in the eastern part of Europe to be communist countries. And he wanted that so that these countries would no longer be countries that a Germany, who twice in the last 3 decades have attacked Russia from, can do it again. Now, FDR doesn't want to say we're going to make them communists, but he also doesn't want to say not to because he doesn't want to offend Stalin. So instead, what FDR promises, and Churchill was not happy with this, was that all these countries over here in Eastern Europe are going to have free elections, they say. And these free elections are not going to be very free because the Russian military is going to be there. And so a lot of these are going to turn into communist puppet states after the war. And so a lot of historians will give FDR grief over this because they're basically saying FDR knew this would happen, but he was willing to let these communist countries take over these people so that he could get Russian support for our war against Japan, which probably is what was happening. And it's unfortunate that it leads to what it leads to, but it was still the decision FDR made. And so that's going to be what comes out of the Yalta Conference. And it just kind of shows that in this post-war period, this rivalry between communism and democracy and capitalism is going to be on the rise. And finally, on May 7th, 1945, what historians call VE Day, the Germans are conquered, where in Berlin, the Russians have come in from the east, the Americans come in from the west, and the war ends. Hitler commits suicide on April 30th. The new German government that rises up is going to sue for peace. And on May 7th, we have Victory in Europe Day. And with that, the war in Europe's over, but that means we now need to turn to the war in Japan. All right, so the war in the Pacific is going to go a little bit different than the war in Europe. It's going to be a little bit smaller scale, and it's mostly just going to be us. You're not going to see almost anything from the Russians, very little from the British, a little bit from the Australians. And so this is going to be mostly the United States fighting against the Japanese. And as you can see on this map, it's mostly going to take place on islands across the Pacific. All right, so in 1942, the Japanese are going to go on a major offensive. Where what they do, we start with the December of 41, where they attack Pearl Harbor, which is over there. They also take over the Philippines. They also go into Indochina, which is today we would call that Vietnam, and Thailand over here. Okay, they also take over Singapore, which is right there, and they also take over the Dutch East Indies, which today we would call Indonesia, and parts of it would be called Malaysia. And then they're going to go into New Guinea, which is right here, in an attempt to eventually go down into Australia, New Zealand, and up into Alaska. So that's what their goal is. Okay, in the middle of that time period, we're going to see a turning point where two things are going to happen. The first is going to be at Coral Sea right here. The next is going to be at Midway right here. So at the Battle of Coral Sea, what ends up happening is the Japanese Navy is going to come down here in an effort to take over the rest of Papua New Guinea, which you can see they did not quite get to the southern part of the island, and their Navy runs into our Navy, the Navy that was left over from the attack at Pearl Harbor. And in the first naval battle in history, where the navies did not see each other, it was just airplanes fighting each other and fighting the boats from aircraft carriers, the Japanese are defeated, long story short. And with that, the Japanese Navy has to turn back. And so they're not going to be able to take over the rest of Papua New Guinea, and they're not going to be able to go to Australia then either. The Battle of Midway, on the other hand, is considered the turning point in the war in the Pacific, where what ends up happening, the Japanese fleet is trying to take over Midway as a springboard to then take over the rest of Hawaii. And whereas Midway itself is a tiny island, what ends up happening is a major battle where the two navies don't ever see each other. It's just airplanes from the American Navy over here, the Japanese Navy over here, flying back and forth, attacking each other. But the major takeaway from this battle is we sank every one of the Japanese aircraft carriers, and without aircraft carriers, their fleet could not guard themselves against air attack. And if they couldn't guard themselves from air attack, that meant they had to get closer to their islands and just stay closer to there so that they could have air cover, or else planes could sink all their boats. And so without the Japanese having any aircraft carriers of significance left after the Battle of Midway, they're going to have to turn back. So this red line that shows how far they were able to expand, that's kind of the high water mark of the war, where from that point, they're going to have to start moving backwards to get closer to their islands. And with them moving backwards, that allows us to begin our offensives, which you can see on these two blue lines down here. And the two offensive campaigns are going to be called island hopping. Sometimes they call it leapfrogging in history books, where basically you're going to have two commanders. The first commander is going to be Chester Nimitz. He was the admiral of the Navy, and he's going to lead an island hopping campaign up this line, okay, as it's working its way up here. The other is going to be Douglas MacArthur. He was the U.S. general in charge of the Army in the Pacific, and he's going to be leading the campaign here. And what island hopping was basically if an island was strongly held, you skipped it. If it was weak, you took it, and then you just tried to starve out the stronger islands. And they're going to use this tactic to work their way across the ocean. The most famous of these island hopping campaigns occurs in the Philippines. All right, so on the Philippines, what ends up happening is Douglas MacArthur has made his way across the Pacific. And by October of 44, we have these battles here. The first battle occurs at Leyte Gulf, which is right where that point is. And Leyte Gulf is basically a huge naval battle, the biggest naval battle in the history of the world, where it's one of the first places where we see the kamikaze attacks that are very famous from World War II, where Japanese pilots and sailors will kill themselves while attacking U.S. planes and boats. But the U.S. do win the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and with that, it frees up our Navy and Army to then proceed into the Philippines, where Douglas MacArthur is going to storm the beaches, as you can see in this picture. And he announces famously, "I have returned," whereas earlier he had left the islands when the Japanese attacked them in 1941, or early 42 by the time he left, saying, "I shall return." So just this famous scene in history, and there he is coming back. And now we move to the end of the war, where what ends up happening is we have the last major islands that need taken. The first is Iwo Jima right there, a relatively small island, but as we get closer to Japan, these islands are held much stronger. It's harder to leapfrog over islands. And so what ends up happening in Iwo Jima is basically a ton of guys die. To make a very long story short, it's a really awful battle where tons of people die. But we do have the famous scene on Mount Suribachi that this photo was a reenactment of. That basically Mount Suribachi, the big mountain on the island, and now this is like the famous picture from World War II that our monument in Washington, D.C. to the soldiers that served in World War II honors. But it was a scene from this battle where we did take the island, albeit gruesomely. The next of these major battles is Okinawa, which you can see right there. And this battle was terrible. Whereas over 180,000 U.S. soldiers participate, over 60,000 will be killed. That was a ton, much higher than the typical ratios you would see in a battle, but in large part is because it was an island that the Japanese were fighting to the very end to hold, as it was one of the southernmost of the Japanese island chain. And out of the 99,570 Japanese soldiers or whatever it was that served there, I think over 99,374 were killed, or somewhere near that number, like a 99.9% rate just about, which shows us how much the Japanese were fighting to hang on as we got closer and closer to Japan. And looking back, it is battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, why a lot of historians, some historians say that that's why we're going to end up using atomic bombs when we get to the island of Japan itself, because just the anticipation for how many people would die and a land invasion was starting to seem astronomical to us. And so these islands obviously were strongly, strongly defended. And now all of a sudden it's July of 1945. Iwo Jima has been taken, Okinawa has been taken, and if you remember in May of 1945, Germany had surrendered. So by July of 45, Germany's now out of the war, but we now need to figure out what to do with Japan. How do we finish Japan? But we also got to start talking about what the post-war world is going to look like. And at this Potsdam conference, notice FDR is not there anymore because he died in April of 1945, and Harry Truman took over. So that's him in the middle. You got Churchill on the left, Stalin on the right. And at this meeting, it's basically going to be a really tense meeting where Truman and Stalin hated each other, Churchill and Stalin hated each other. And so Truman and Churchill are both kind of working against the Russians to a degree. It feels like, even though we're still allies, it appears that there's a lot of tension that is obviously going to be occurring as we move forward into the post-war era, as we will call that tension the Cold War. At this meeting, there's a dispute where Truman basically is going to tell Stalin that, hey, we just successfully tested atomic weapons. We may not need your support in Japan after all. But then Stalin says, hey, I already know that you tested these weapons. My spies told me before. So basically, how do the Russian spies know that we have atomic weapons when it was the most closely guarded secrets? And so it is this meeting at Potsdam where not only do they outline what's going to happen after the war, most famously how Germany was going to be broken up, but also we see that tension that is going to lead us directly into the Cold War. And whereas FDR was more of a moderator between Churchill and Stalin, Truman is not. Truman despises Stalin. And so the Cold War stage is being set by these leaders here. And now we get to the end of the war. The end of the war actually begins all the way back before the war in Poland, Germany versus Poland, even began in August of 39, where Albert Einstein, many of you are aware of who he is, very famous scientist who comes over from Europe, and he tells FDR that friends of his in the scientific community in Central Europe were being told by the Nazi government to develop atomic weapons. He explains to FDR what those are. FDR realizes, my goodness, we can't let a person like Hitler have access to weapons like this. And so we need to develop them first, even though we are not in the war yet. We won't even be in the war for about 2.5 years at this point. We knew we need to do this, so we begin the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the name of the project to develop atomic weapons. And there's whole books that have been written about this. And suffice it to say that after 6 years of top secret, highly classified everything, where all sorts of stuff is done to keep all this stuff secret, we develop atomic weapons that work. One of them we test in the desert of the American Southwest, and it worked. So now we know that it works, and we had 2 more. Okay, Fat Man and Little Boy were their nicknames, and they were the 2 that were ready to use. Okay, now there was a big decision as to whether to use the bomb or not. In fact, that bullet point that says decision to drop the bomb has actually been a DBQ before, where the competing arguments on the one hand, some people said it was racist that we did it, that we would use it on the Japanese, but not on Europeans. And whereas racism almost certainly plays a role in a lot of things in American history, I don't know that we want to use it for this. In large part because, A, Germany was already out of the war by the time we had the bomb, so we aren't positive that Truman wouldn't have dropped it on Germany had he had the opportunity. We also aren't positive that he would have. But I would not oversell that argument since we don't know definitively what the answer would actually be. Another argument that historians say, and it is very plausible, is that we didn't need to drop the bombs on Japan, but that we did it just to kind of intimidate Joseph Stalin, intimidate the Soviets, as we recognized that he would be a big force for the negative after the war. And so we needed to make sure he knew we were willing to do whatever it took to stop him. And there is evidence that suggests that was part of the decision. But the strongest argument most historians believe, at least it's the one that kind of history is sort of settled upon, not that these other arguments bear no weight at all, is that basically we did it to save lives, that people believed that attacking Japan by using the bomb, I mean, obviously it would kill Japanese people, needless to say, but that it would save American lives, as American soldiers would not need to then invade the island of Japan itself, and so that would save hundreds of thousands of our own lives. The military estimates said that over 1 million Americans would die in the invasion of the Japanese islands. But obviously, the problem with dropping the bomb is we had to drop it on, or I don't know that we had to, but we dropped it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in which case the problem with doing that is we're mostly hitting civilian targets. So that's obviously going to cause a lot of controversy, as over 250,000 people directly die from these two bomb blasts, or 270,000. And then many more will die indirectly from radiation and things like that. So obviously it's a big event. It was a huge decision. Truman definitely struggled with it. It was not easy. We have records of his where he kind of goes back and forth on it, but eventually decided to do it. And the agreed upon story of historians, and because it's what Truman basically confirmed is what caused him to do it, is his goal was to save American lives. So that's why he ultimately did it. But just know that's been a whole DBQ before, so it's good to have an awareness of the different arguments. So what ended up happening first, we dropped leaflets on Japan the day, I think it was August 4th, or it might have been the 5th, basically saying that we plan on bombing one of your cities. And so you can surrender, or we're going to blow up one of your cities. And they didn't surrender, obviously. So on August 6th, we're going to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. And that's going to kill a lot of people, obviously. Okay. Then on August 9th, 1945, on August 8th, we had warned them again, we're going to drop another bomb if you guys don't surrender. They didn't surrender, so we drop a bomb on Nagasaki, and that's going to kill a few less people than Hiroshima, just because it's a smaller city, but still killed a ton of people. And so that obviously happened. Then on August 14th, 1945, we basically gave the Japanese government another chance to surrender. There was a huge fight in Japan between military leaders and the emperor. The emperor wanted to go on the radio and announce to the Japanese people that they were surrendering. The military did not want to. There was a fight in the palace between the emperor's bodyguards and military special forces that was won by the emperor's bodyguards. So the emperor goes on the radio and announces to the Japanese people that they will be surrendering. And the surrender was made official September 2nd. On deck, the USS Missouri, that you can see there, where a representative of the Japanese government is meeting Douglas MacArthur, the head of the U.S. Army in the Pacific, and all that paperwork on the table is basically just the official surrender paperwork of the Japanese. And so there's a famous scene that gets immortalized where a soldier hears about the end of the war, because now the Japanese are out. Obviously, World War II is over altogether, and is celebrating by doing whatever that picture is, grabbing a stranger and kissing her, and definitely don't recommend that, but there it is, famous scene from history. So now we'll just look at some pictures of the what happened with the atomic explosions. Obviously, very important event from history. Okay, there is Fat Boy, it was called. I believe that was the one that was dropped on Nagasaki. There's a picture of the Enola Gay flight crew. That was the name of the bomber that actually dropped these bombs. They were trained to do this. Okay, here's a picture of the explosion, although I think that explosion might actually be, that one I think is from Hiroshima, I believe, but either way, it's not that important. Just these are pictures showing you what happens. There's the mushroom cloud that atomic bombs are famous for. Okay, there's a picture of the ground in Hiroshima. Obviously, you can see a lot of stuff got decimated. There's a picture of where the bomb was dropped. There's a picture of what it looked like after. You can see that pretty much every building that was not made out of reinforced concrete immediately got leveled to the ground. There's just a different angle of the same amount of destruction. Obviously, just really sad, awful event. Because again, I mean, in war things happen, obviously, but just tons and tons of civilian deaths here. So this definitely has some problems with it. So, okay, there's a picture of Little Man. That was the one that was dropped on Hiroshima, excuse me. There's a picture of the mushroom cloud, and there's a picture of Nagasaki. Don't ask me why I got these on different slides, but as you can see, same kind of thing, just decimated area, no buildings left. There's a picture. The top is what it looked like the day before we dropped the bomb. The bottom is what it looked like the day after. You can see just civilization wiped out. There's a picture of some of the victims. They were obviously not in the direct blast, or they would not have survived in any way whatsoever. But they were just people who were within range of the atomic flash. So it obviously scalded her face and his head and hands. His hands must have been covering his face. As you can see, they're burnt really severely. There's a picture of a person being carried out. They would die soon thereafter, but obviously got just absolutely just blasted by the heat. There's famous one of the shadows of Hiroshima, if you've ever heard of that, where basically where people were, objects were, the atomic flash incinerated all the dirt away and just left the shadows of, like, there's a person standing there, there's a ladder that was obviously next to them. There's a picture of an old person walking with a cane that got obviously incinerated onto the steps there. So obviously they're just gone. And so basically what we did in those two cities just completely decimated two societies. And yet with that, the war is over. So with the war being over, the U.S. is now going to move into the post-war period. It's going to be a period of a lot of change. As we move through the rest of the 1940s, I'm going to do one more PowerPoint just talking about the change that's going on at home, and then a PowerPoint talking about the change that's going on abroad as the Cold War starts.